Hello and welcome back to Doing Death with your host, Jan. Today we're going to explore loss and grief. How do we cope during a bereavement? And how do we continue with life after death? This episode, entitled Life After Death, is dedicated to Leon John Hunt. Regardless of the circumstances of death, losing someone we love is probably the single most awful experience we'll ever have to go through. The loss of a loved one and the grief which follows is a full-on emotional roller coaster, filled with immense feelings of sadness, despair, and emptiness. In the weeks following a bereavement, just being able to cope with life's ordinary day-to-day tasks can escape us, and we might become absent-minded or forgetful. We may lose our appetite and not want to get dressed in the mornings, or we may be unable to face anyone for a few days. After we lose someone, life may seem chaotic, uncertain, and we may swing between shock and disbelief, or even feel shame and regret about not having said goodbye properly and not telling the person how much we love them. We may feel a sense of detachment from what's happened, or that no one really understands what we're going through. It's important that there's some practical support when you've suffered a bereavement. Those are the families I deal with at the beginning of their grief journey seem always to cope better when there are people around that they can talk to, for a shoulder to cry on. And it's okay to feel vulnerable and in a place of need. It's okay to rely on others and to feel emotionally or physically weak. And having someone to check in on us to find out how we're doing and to pick up on any daily responsibilities is a good idea. We're never prepared for the death of someone we love. Even when the passing is expected, we're never emotionally equipped for when the end arrives. The grief experience is said to happen in stages, and although these stages might be expressed in various ways, crying, withdrawal, moodiness, anxiety, it's been shown that grief in fact happens in 5 stages, and these stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression and acceptance, which won't necessarily occur in that strict order and is dependent on our individual personality as well as the circumstances surrounding the loss. It's also possible to enter in and out of the stages, or to enter a stage more than once. And for this reason, I prefer to see the stages of grief more as a cycle of grief. It's possible to observe all aspects of the grief journey with the individuals I work with, from the first meeting with them through to when I may work with them later or several months after the bereavement. In my role as a funeral arranger, I'm generally meeting families who are at the early stages of a bereavement, and for this reason, anger is the emotion which tends to show up the most. I work with a lot of families who are having to come to terms with a death which wasn't expected and has happened suddenly. Many of us have family and friends who are living with long-term illnesses, Thanks to advancements in medicine, many continue to lead fairly normal lives whilst living with conditions such as cancer, diabetes and hypertension. Adjustments to the home may need to be made and to lifestyle, but generally the quality of life isn't severely impacted and death isn't imminent. This means that families are sort of carrying on with life as normal. The difficulties, the challenges arise when someone with a long-term illness dies unexpectedly, usually in the hospital during a routine procedure. And deaths like these are extremely painful for the families to cope with, because the person appeared well prior to to being admitted to hospital, and the death has happened unexpectedly, so there's shock and anger and a sense of being robbed. As well as coping with the grief, there are now so many questions the family have to ask as to why this has happened, and this causes acute levels of stress. For many in this situation, it's the first time having to deal with hospital bureaucracy, unfamiliar medical terminology, and a coroner will have to be involved if the cause of death can't be ascertained. And if a post-mortem is required to determine the cause of death, this results in the family being unable to set a date for the funeral. When I meet families in these instances, they are devastated. There's a sense of being robbed of the person and their time with them, and they are often inconsolable. But it's not uncommon for someone who's had a sudden bereavement to initially come across as brash or hostile. Of course, I put this down to the overwhelming nature of the loss, which makes the person want to lash out and make sense of what's happened to them. But anger can also be a barrier that people put up as an alternative to appearing vulnerable. And anger features heavily where someone has passed away unexpectedly. And in these instances, it's not uncommon for the bereaved to voice concerns about the care their loved one received, or to even blame themselves for not being present at the bedside when the death occurred. When someone's died due to advanced years or has been suffering with an age-related disease, the death is generally said to be expected. Diseases such as Alzheimer's are becoming more common. Alzheimer's causes confusion, loss of memory and lack of autonomy, which means there's generally a rapid decline in the person's health when they're nearing the end of life. If the person is admitted to hospital and is placed on an end-of-life care plan, death usually occurs within days, not weeks. When I meet with a bereaved family after a death like this, a discussion about the person's quality of life always comes up. Families often speak in terms of the person being unrecognisable in the latter stages of their life, unable to remember who their children are, unable to walk or to eat. And although these changes in the person are really traumatic for all involved, the quality of life is so diminished. The family see death as a kind of release and are relieved when the person finally passes away, because this means the end of suffering. Families who've experienced an expected death will often mention that it had become difficult to see the person as they were, or that the person didn't want to go on anymore and had had enough and were ready to say goodbye. There are many reasons why a death occurs: illness, accident, homicide, suicide, and there will be a multitude of sub-reasons as to the specific cause of death. Regardless of the circumstance of death and the devastation involved, there are strictly two categories of how a death comes about. It's either expected or unexpected. Experiencing a death is awful, no matter the circumstances. We're plunged into having to interpret, to understand, and to come to terms with this immeasurable amount of pain. This is grief. Grief is a normal process after someone dies. It provides the time and space we need to sit with the pain following a death, a chance to recover, and finally come to a place of acceptance. It may feel for a time that life will never be the same after someone dies. When we think about the person we've lost, that there is something that's missing. But acute feelings of pain do subside, and fond and happy memories will instead begin to fill the void. After a death, the sense of loss can come like waves. Sometimes we can go for many months without feeling the pain of loss, and then anniversaries, birthdays and Christmases come round, or when we're in certain places and situations, the sadness is all consuming again, and we're torn between putting on a brave face for those around us and feeling overwhelmed. In these times, it's okay not to be okay. We place a lot of pressure on ourselves to be doing just fine, but recognising that we're not ourselves helps to remove that facade or mask and the need to conform, especially when everyone around us seems to be happy. Time is the only gift which grants the space and opportunity to move forward after a death, to a place where it's possible to remember our loved ones as they were, to create new memories with those who are still with us, and to heal from the pain of loss. I mentioned earlier that support after a bereavement is really important. Everyone's situation is different. There may be no friends or family to confide in or provide support, or you may feel that you don't want to burden those around you. But talking through how we're feeling is crucial in the healing process. And if you don't feel you can talk to those around you, there's the support of professional bereavement care organisations and plenty of information online on how to book sessions with a grief therapist. Bereavement counselling isn't for everyone. We all cope with grief differently, but if you feel you need to work through your grief, then I would recommend that you do this with a professional, and I've provided some links below. Counselling is one of the ways we can work through our grief. Another is to express our emotions through creativity. Art and painting and drawing can help to connect us with our feelings and recognise where we are in our grief journey. But sometimes grief gets stuck and doesn't go away, maybe for months or years after the loss. If you find that you're spiralling into serious symptoms like a depression that won't go away, or maybe having suicidal thoughts, contact a professional immediately for support. I've listed the links to bereavement support websites below, and if you have any questions or want to contact us, then feel free to do so at doingdeathwithjan@outlook.com, or send your comments via our YouTube channel. The links below. Remember, life and death are sides of the same coin. To contemplate death is to ensure we make the most of life. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care and live well.